liberal. I haven't really seen that much
Yes.
of your content though.
Yeah, I'm a huge big fat liberal. So yeah, I talk mostly about gun stuff and like the Second Amendment rights and things like that, the right to self-defense. That kind of stuff is my speed. And so it's really important to me that we have strong ethics around violence, right? And that we, when we're talking about violence and causing harm and all of these things, I think it's reasonable to be like, wait a second, where else in our lives are we maybe executing violence? And one of the things that we constantly ignore, I think, as a society is where are we getting our food? Right? Like, where are we getting our products that we buy under capitalism? Because I do accept that socialist critique in a sense that, yeah, there's a lot of unethical consumption with capitalism. So there's some common ground already, and I'm with you on objective ethics being what we should do.
Okay, so
Um,
you're with us on
so
objective ethics. It
mhm.
seems you're getting there with socialism. It sounds like you're just on the cusp of socialism. You're like, oh well, capitalism's not ethical, you know. At least in many ways, in which like a lot of production isn't ethical. So, in terms of vegan ethics, where do you lie on that? Like animal ethics?
So yeah, so right now where I kind of sit is I don't like factory farming. Um, I am okay with like people. I think like I and this is where I start to struggle too because like I'm okay with people eating meat in say survival situations. I think hunting can be perfectly ethical and reasonable. Um, I think that it kind of depends on like how we get here. When we're discussing like the moral imperatives around like eating animals or killing animals for a purpose. And that, in a sense, I can be okay with. Like, I can be okay with certain purposes, but not others. Like, I think like
Right.
pest control is an issue. I don't. Have you ever heard the 30 to 50 feral hogs meme?
No.
Like, so there was people were like, "Oh, what do you need an AR-15 for?" And I think it was some guy on Twitter or something, right? And he's like, "Well, I need it because there's 30 to 50 feral hogs on my property, and they're gonna come stampede and like kill my, like stomp on my children and kill them, and I can't have that. So I need this high capacity, weapon that or this weapon capable of high capacity magazine use, right? So I can just fire a lot into them and and deal with it and protect my children. And that's
I
an
mean,
actual
like,
problem, like in
I
Texas,
mean,
right?
like,
Like,
I mean, I get it. It's like saving someone's life. Like, so for example, like, I don't know, let's say there was 10 to 15 people in general, just humans on your property, and they were going to murder your family. Yeah, man, use the AR-15. I don't have
yeah,
a problem with that. And I don't think that's like speciesist. And I think that the
right.
main thing is speciesism. It's like you said, like before. Um, well, what about survival situations? Well, it's like, well, yeah, same thing. It's like I don't care if people eat people in those situations. I mean, best if they don't, and I would rather that if there was a way around it, then you are obliged to obviously get around it. But if your plane crashes in the Andes and,
Mhm.
it's you or them, I'm not going to judge you for eating that person. Like, it doesn't make you wrong for doing it. I don't think I think ethics has broken down at that point. The point of obligation to yourself and the other has come into conflict, and you've got to choose between self-preservation and self-sacrifice, and in both cases, so you're sacrificing yourself or the other, and it's tragic. That's the reality of the situation there. So I think survival situations and places in like, these sort of ethical extremes where ethics breaks down, I don't think are the best picture for when we look at animal ethics, in general, because I think that our main
Yeah.
interaction with animals is, 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I think that in terms of how we're approaching those things, it's purely for a hedonistic pleasure, not necessarily for, well, I don't think it's for need at all. So, and then in terms of like, people hunting, I don't think hunting's justified. I don't think, unless it was like necessary, as you said before, I don't think there is a justification that you can give for hunting that would really make it, that would really justify, taking another animal's life, another being's life. And it's really the consideration. You say it's about violence when we look at the state, and we look at like why we care about people being violent, and it's because of the harm perpetuated upon other individuals, like the fact that it would essentially it would disrespect their liberty, like their autonomy. It overrides their consent. And I think that when you put a bullet in the through the neck of a deer, or through the head of a deer, or you spear it, or you use a crossbow or whatever, you're definitely disregarding that being,
Mhm.
regardless of its intellectual capacities. Would you think that just to make it instantly more contentious, do you think that it would be okay to hunt humans, like the proper most dangerous game? I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, The Most
Oh
Dangerous.
God, I was thinking of I was thinking of like high school, like community college English classes with that one.
Oh God.
Where we read that. I don't know. Like, I mean, I was a soldier for U.S. Army for like 8 years, right? Like, I did the reserve thing. I did a tour in Iraq. Like, I don't have qualms about. I guess this is something where like some people get all the shock value, but it's like I don't have qualms about people dying and about like people killing each other necessarily. I have qualms about the conditions where that happens, right? So in terms of
I don't think
hunting,
it's necessarily wrong. Like, no, actually, no. Just finish that. Like, let you go.
so I don't think killing in and of itself is inherently wrong, right?
Right.
I think that we're looking at other maybe like predicates or preconditions to the killing that are going to make it look wrong to us. So like when I look at a killing as wrong, it's like that's where also this kind of falls apart because I don't think it's just like selfishness in and of itself makes it wrong. Right, like because I can be self-interested in a case of self-defense, and we generally say, well, ethics have broken down, or that was an ethical use of self-defense, and that's typically where people will go, or they'll say self-defense is unethical, period. Which is more of that's a take that I don't hear that often. I don't hear many people saying that, but so I'm trying to kind of like, and this is where I struggle too, because I can look at, okay, well, what is it that makes killing unethical, right? In some contexts, and it seems like intent is a factor, so selfishness could be a factor, but you could also be as altruistic as you want and murder someone, right? Like, right? So I like.
No, I don't think so. But
Identifying and putting the finger on that, I don't know.
I would say that I'd say when we look at something like murder, the reason I would say it was wrong is the disregard of subjectivity of the other. So I would say that when we look at other beings, like other sentient beings, we can see that they are conscious creatures having their own value experience in the world. And when we take their life for something that is, based on our preferences, rather than necessity, as was said with survival situations, when it's a preference to take their life or not, then we are disregarding their interests, their subjectivity. And the reason that we're engaged in this pursuit in the first place is to maximize subjectivity, namely our own subjectivity. We are moving towards I think Nietzsche calls it the will to power, the expression of strength against the world. And I would say that in order to do that, in the first place, to even act in an egoistical way, you require universal concepts, and universal concepts apply to more than one individual. And this is why I would say that even self-interested notions actually tie into like notions of law, order, and mutual well-being. That in the embrace of universal concepts of ethics, do we find our own happiness and the happiness of the other? And this is something that's been, been ongoing since ancient Greece, and the concept of eudaimonia.
I am a little trained. I have an associate's and I'm working on the undergrad right now. So
oh, that's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, so that was why this was actually really cool to me, because it's like I can talk to someone who has like 2 to 3 times the formal training that I do and at the higher level, and I can like help kind of I'm going to use a military term here. I can help unfuck my understanding.
Are you sure that's not a military term?
It's a very military term. But yeah, and that's more or less my goal for this conversation. Because if I walk away understanding you, like for me, that's my goal. And I want to make sure that I do understand.
Most of my chat's cool. Like, I'm not gonna lie. I think that's most people's goal when they click on my channel. Like, what the fuck is he saying? Like,
right?
yeah, absolutely. I understand. But in that, so like you said that you haven't got a problem with people killing people necessarily, not in and of itself, which is fair enough. You're not a moral absolutist. That's fair enough. But you do have a problem with people. Let's say someone walks into a school and massacres a bunch of children. I'm assuming that's
Right. Yeah.
That's not okay. Why would you think that was wrong?
I think your answer is pretty strong, and I think that's the answer I'm kind of tending towards. It's that respect of their subjectivity, right? So,
Right.
But this is where I think we start to get into the more interesting part, because I think establishing that if there are other minds in the room that are just like ours, we all share some basic. I think this is what I messaged you yesterday in the chat. I'm like, this is what I'm referring to as kind of an axiomatic value. It's a value that I think is just present. It's just there. It's not just culturally we've asserted this or anything like that. It's like, no, like we all have being, right? And part of that being is experience. We're trying to maximize that experience. If that's what we're calling subjectivity, then this makes sense. And that's more or less like my hasty summary, I think, of that point from the objective ethics video that you did. That was another point that actually I wanted to confirm with you if I have that close enough to write to move on, or
Yeah,
if
yeah.
I'm missing details.
I think you got it there. I think the only thing I would say is with axiomatic, I'm not a fan because axiomatic implies that you've just sort of you can pick and choose axioms, right? Like maths, like like whether we're going to accept like Euclidean or non-Euclidean geometry and stuff like that. And if we assume this axiom, then what follows? What I would say is that it's not something that we can assume. It's not something that is doubtable. Like it's indubitable. So it's like a priori synthetic, I would argue. So like in terms of a Kantian vocabulary. So that means like a priori, for those who don't have any philosophical training, a priori means prior to experience, and is usually associated with something analytic, true in itself. And
I'm
the
with
truth,
that.
and
I agree.
synthetic is something which is true after, or shown is something that is shown to be true after experience, or inexperience rather. It is you require the synthesis in order to actually gain truth value. Now, the reason that seems like a bit of a mismatch is because Kant is a lunatic, but also a genius. Because what he realized is that a priori, meaning something that is prior to experience, can sometimes only be shown to be true in and of itself in experience. And one of the examples he gives is something like 1 + 1 = 2, or like a triangle having 3 sides. A triangle having 3 sides is something that requires the notions of space, which is an experiential property. We have to experience a triangle in order to really understand that. And he also points out like 1 + 1 = 2. That requires the experience of time. You have to actually fulfill the equation in order to come to the conclusion that it is tautological. And so that's what I would say in terms of ethical value in our relationship with the other. We internally have a conception of our own value, but in experiencing the other, we understand them as a radical alternative, as it's called, which means a freedom outside of our own, an external mind, and having that external mind is what allows us to create concepts and language and all of this. And I would say that it's something that's not something that can be doubted without actually destroying the conditions of language and skepticism from which you're used to doubt it. And that's why I would say the axiomatic. I can see the job that it's doing, but I think it's done better with like a priori. But that might just be me. That might just be me being pedantic. But yeah, I think that you've got that. I think that.
Okay.
I think that makes sense.
That's where I'm kind of interested in driving, because ultimately it seems like this is also coming to some concept of consent, and then now I think like this is where I generally write. And if I may, do you mind if I engage in a very hasty generalization of vegans? I understand. I understand that this is false. So I want to do it. So there's a few different types of vegans that I've seen, and you're not any of these, right? But there's so like we've had like that. There's the kind of obnoxious vegan, like, and this is me as a non-vegan, right? Where it's like there's someone who talks down a lot. They use like these big like shock arguments. So like their marginal cases are like, yeah, like you get these arguments like Godwin's law type stuff, like, oh well, Hitler ate me. You don't want to be like Hitler, do you? Like, and you get these like kind of absurd like.
I know the feeling. People keep telling us.
You know what I mean? Yeah. And then there's on the other side that there's like the closet vegan that, and I've had this where there's the coworker at work that's a vegan, and they're like, if you look at what they're eating, you can tell. And if you ask them, they'll say yes. And if you ask them why, they'll just be like, oh, I don't know, it's just kind of what I do, and you do you, and I do me, and like they're just super agreeable, and they won't defend the proposition because voice, right? And
I understand that, yeah.
And then there's like the online like fake vegan, like the I'm a vegan on YouTube. If it gets me views, I'll quit veganism if it gets me views. I'll pick a new fad, you know.
The whole community, yeah. Yeah.
And then we have the people that are having the actual conversation about it, and that's what I feel like you're doing, and that's actually why I wanted to talk to you about it in particular as well. Because I think like. I've been ran through on Name the Trait, and someone will be like, is cannibalism unethical to you? And I'll be like, no, not necessarily. Like,
I'm not.
You
I'm
know,
not gonna lie.
and I'll,
Name the trade's
go
not
ahead.
where I go. Like I don't. I think like if we go marginal cases, then it's a bit better because then I think I think the whole point of it is like, and I think the difference, and I will say this, and it might be a bit contentious, and I don't mean to call out Isaac and name the trade again because I don't think it's an invalid argument. It's not, but the way that it's usually perpetuated, like actually used is usually not the way I would engage in argumentation like that. I would say that it's like a lot of the time it's just looking for contradiction and then the conversation ends. Um, in ancient Greece, that was basically what sophists did, and the difference between a sophist and a philosopher is the pursuit for truth. So it's to go like, look, like yeah, we've hit a contradiction, and now let's see whether we can find the truth together. And that's why there's plenty of contradictions in the Socratic dialogues, and the conversation keeps going. And I think that's really important. And obviously, you're doing philosophy, so you'll see that a lot. And I think that is the primary difference between something like usually how marginal cases is applied and name the trade. Like a lot of the time, I mean, don't get me wrong, you get people who use name the trade properly, in the right way. Do you know what I mean? And some people use it good and some people use it bad. But I think that marginal cases, one of the what's the word, propositions in marginal cases, um, is essentially relevant falsehood. No, it wasn't relevant falsehood. Relevant. What is it? It's relevant. More was it? It's like relevant moral difference or something like that. I can't remember the exact terminology now. But the point of the matter is that when you get to a point in like in marginal cases, you go, why? Why do you think that this like this like why do you think it's okay to kill disabled people, or why do you think it's not okay to kill disabled people and then kill animals? And usually that's where we end up. It's like it's an aid to the Socratic dialogue, and that's all I really see it as. I don't think that anyone who tries to argue purely normatively in this, without questioning the foundations of how the individual is first understanding the words good, is going to end up in a bad place. But luckily, we pretty much went through the meta ethics. You've already said like it's about consent, it's about subjectivity, and so like I don't need to run marginal cases on you because I already know what you're gonna like. At least like to a certain degree. I mean, I can ask you like, what do you think of certain scenarios, but it's not going to necessarily teach me anything that is um like I can then at least answer. I can respond to whether you are accepting subjectivity as this as the foundation of ethics and consent as the foundation of ethics, like later on in the conversation. And I think that's necessary to really allow the conversation to flow.
Yeah.
So,
So
like in the school
this is where I
shooter scenario,
struggle.
take it to the school shooter scenario.
Yeah.
So a school shooter killing, that goes in, starts massacring innocent people. Now, in that scenario, what is he's disrespecting other individuals, and you would see that as wrong. Do you think that is comparable to the disrespect that we do to animals, or not?
Um, I don't know yet, and I want to justify why I don't know, if I can. So the first thing is it is interesting because of how we view consent with children, which is a big factor. There's adults in the school who obviously don't consent to dying that day, right? Like we can safely say that.
Yeah.
But for the children in the school, and in Western culture, and I think this is something you pointed out as well, and I think this adds a layer of complexity here that I
Yeah.
struggle to get past. And it's like, well, children don't really consent in a way that we consider to be consent. Like a child, like I'm a parent of two boys, right? And with my kids, I know if my kids tell me that they want something, right? My oldest son will eat ice cream until he is sick, right? Or eat whatever
Wow.
sugary food until he's sick, right?
Yeah.
And so in that context, it's like, well, I don't think that if you knew you'd be sick that you would do that. And like I'm kind of having to like I see you as I've been using the term moral subject, right? I'm a moral agent where I can understand and I can consent and I can I have this depth, this grasp of the depth of the context I'm operating in to where my decisions are what we'd consider deliberate. And I don't think that my child has that. And I think that's kind of like a backdrop or something similar to that as a backdrop for consent. And so then when I transition to animals, I kind of have the same question. It doesn't seem like animals have that same kind of factor of consent. Maybe they have this type of consent that the child can do. Right. There's a certain capacity of reason. There's a certain capacity for these things, and animals don't have them. But that in no way indicates that animals aren't of a moral regard. And so then I go, okay, but like, because I would still say, well, I shouldn't be torturing animals to death in a factory farm, right? Like, that seems obviously wrong. And if we even if we are going to say eating animals is okay, we should at least stop that. And I think that's something that you and I would agree on.
Yeah.
But in that sense, like it's strange because then it seems like consent's not a factor for when I'm dealing with moral subjects. Rather, I'm interacting with this kind of like moral imagination. To steal a term from like Bandis and Nussbaum. But I'm interacting with kind of my moral imagination of what I think they would actually consent to. And it's like, but like, how do I get away with that? And and this is where this kind of falls apart for me. And this is where I kind of need help like walking through, like if I'm on base with this or what. But this is something I wanted to ask you.
I mean, like when you talk about consent, I would say it's the expression of subjectivity in the first place. It's the respect of someone's autonomy and freedom. And so when someone is engaged in in trying to express their subjectivity in the world and trying to express their freedom, they're trying to achieve desires, they're trying to achieve a certain end, and an end is in relation to their experiences in the world. And I think that the reality is that we are all very much well aware of the end of our lives being something which we want to be purposeful, meaningful, and that meaning usually relates, when we talk about it, to the production of a better outcome for like everyone. And then that's why we talk about meaning rather than just simply, our own egoistical experience of pain and pleasure.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
But so like sometimes, adults will self-sacrifice, for example, for their children, for their society. For example, you joined the military, you probably did it because of notions of duty and so on. But the reality of the situation is that's fair enough. But the thing is that it's always in respect to the subjectivity from which is trying to maximize its strength against the world. It's not individual and egoistic. It's universal. It's everyone doing the same thing and trying to rationalize how to do it. But overall, it's always in relation to what we want, the desires we are trying to maximize. So when we talk about consent, for example, there are times when we would override an individual's consent. For example, if we believe they're insane, and we would judge their insanity depending upon what they're actually trying to achieve. And because we would realize, well, wait a minute, this person is acting in such a way as to produce a consequence which would not be rational to produce. They're trying to set themselves on fire or something like that. That's awful. We're going to stop them. We're not going to let them, we're going to override their subjectivity in that. Because what we see is them trying to perpetuate something which is harmful to themselves, from which, if they were rational, they would not consent to. Or like the guy that tried to get himself eaten by a cannibal in Germany. We will stop them because we're like, well, look, cannibalism's we're not letting you kill people, and we're not letting you commit suicide. And that's just how that's going down. Because we recognize that the perpetuation of these acts ultimately undermines what consent is in relationship to. It's in relationship to the well-being and value within an individual's life. That an individual, when they're acting, when they're being urged to action in the first place, it's through desires, it's through a system of drives that is driving them towards trying to achieve a good life and a valuable end. And if that end is not valuable, if they're trying to do something which is self-destructive, it's going to cause harm to society, to themselves, and so on, then we override their consent. So when we talk about consent in the first place, it's almost a means to an end, when there are limits to consent. And that's in relation to what consent is in reference to. Consent is valuable only because it's trying to maximize subjectivity. So when we consider that a child cannot consent in the same way as an adult, one of the things that we want to do is to say, like, it's not that a child can't say yes or no. A child can say yes or no. A child can even think that they want the thing that the adult is telling, that might have even conditioned and groomed them or something to want. And we know this. But we know that the child is incapable of the reasoning that would allow them to actually understand the consequences of their actions, and so actually express their subjectivity in a rational way. So we say, look, you're not capable of consent. That doesn't mean they're not capable of experiencing what consent is in relation to, and we reject their capacity for consent for the very respect that we have for what consent stands for, which is expression of subjectivity. So So when I say, like someone bursts into a school and okay, there's adults there certainly not consenting to die, but the children, even if, as you say, like use this moral imagination, you're trying to work out what they want. Well, the way that you'd work out what they want is by what they are, by understanding their experiences in the world. You understand they're going to feel pain. You understand that they have, desires that go beyond this moment. You understand
Yeah.
that there is a life narrative that can be that can be developed in order to understand what is a good life for that individual to live and how this would be ended tragically too young. And with that knowledge, you're armed with that knowledge, you can go, look, we should stop school shooters, and we shouldn't allow this to continue.
Yeah. So this is, and this is where, so I want to develop off of that now. So, because I think I can agree with most of that, and then let me know where I'm going awry here in like my current kind of way of thinking in your view.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm seeing that, and then I'm seeing also an issue, right? Which would be, okay, well, if there's a bunch of different definitions for veganism. So we have like veganism is like this preservation of animal welfare in such a degree where animals are liberated and given human rights. I've seen that. I've seen veganism is just don't eat animal products and don't buy like animal, like leather clothes and things like that, or like a leather couch. I've seen a whole bunch of different definitions for veganism along different veins, and I'm just kind of wondering like what definition I guess do we want to argue for today? Because like this week, actually, I can let you know this week that I've gone more vegetarian, I guess you could say. I'm still consuming some animal products. I still have a whole bunch of meat products and stuff in my fridge, but I've been going out of my way to not be like eating a bunch of animal flesh this week.
I'm very
So
happy to
figure,
hear that you're making like
so
the steps.
yeah. And oh god, remind me, because I want to come back to that note too on the incrementalism with this, because that's also like that's something that's really weird to me as well. It's just a strange thing with this topic, but yeah, so I'm like, okay, but if I could find out a way to ethically milk a cow where I'm not killing the young, the cow is free and lives a good life on the farm, it's coming up to me and somehow it wants to be milked. Maybe that's one thing, and maybe I can consume that milk, and maybe the same for eggs or something like that. But then, like, I would hear a lot of vegans say that's not real veganism, and then I kind of get confused because it's like, well, these are things that are based in consent. Like we have humans that eat placenta. That's personally gross to me, but I don't think that my personal disgust really weighs into
I
the
think it's kind
ethical
of
equation.
interesting, but I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think it's
So, but yeah, so what are your thoughts on like if we could theoretically have this like consent from chickens, and we can see that chickens laying eggs and us taking them is like a non-issue, or a cow walking up to us and wanting to be milked is a non-issue, like where would you fall on that?
I mean, just getting sort of back to the like before that, you said that like obviously you're saying that you were incrementally reducing meat intake, which is cool. I'm glad they're on the right path there. You said something else though, before whether a cow could consume, different definitions of veganism. The definition that I would endorse primarily is actually just the Vegan Society definition. I think it's fit for purpose. People pretty much, it's like the first vegan definition. Well, actually, the first one that they wrote was far simpler, but I think this is probably the most, pretty much well-structured definition. People will agree, some people will disagree, but this is the one that I gatekeep. So I think that, like, what is it? Veganism is a philosophy and a way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, for food, clothing, and other purposes. And they do this for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment, right?
Okay.
I think that it basically sets out what the concept entails, which is supposed to be the beginning and end of vegetarianism, which is essentially the consideration of animals as the other, considering animals as having subjectivity and being being valuable in and of themselves. And so, that's really what I think. It just basically points out we don't engage in exploitation and cruelty to animals. And we avoid it as far as possible and practicable, and it's for the benefit of animals primarily, but then also it benefits humans and the environment. So it's for the benefit of all sentient beings, and that it's a sentient disposition. And I think that's what I would say veganism ought to always be saying. People who say it's just a diet, there was a vegan YouTuber who's actually a father of two other twin vegan YouTubers, and he's trying to argue. Yeah, he's trying to argue that He's an absolute arsehole, actually, if I'm honest. I'll find out who he is. No, fuck that guy. But because he's trying to argue that vegans are wrong for saying that it's anything other than a diet. Because he pointed towards the vegan society, and then the leadership. There was these two guys who were leaders in the vegan society, one after the other. There was the founder, who he said didn't see veganism as anything other than diet. And then there was the guy who came after it, who made it this sort of definition, which I gave you. Well, they were actually like very close friends. It was like Donald Watson, and I can't remember the other guy's name. Donald Watson was the founder, and he actually wrote an essay, who is apparently supposed to be okay about leather and so on. And he wrote an essay, one of the most contentious things you could imagine for contemporary society, with when you say something like this, when you wrote it, on the emancipation of animals.
Right,
and,
because that's like mind-blowingly like on my end. I hear that title and I'm just like, what the fuck does this mean? Like are we like and that's I'm like, are we giving animals human rights? And then how far does that go? Like, I can't give a cow the right to vote. That doesn't make sense.
Well, this is the thing,
right?
exactly. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily engage in and I think Peter Singer makes the best argument for this. Engaging in a rights discussion can sometimes be misleading. When you talk about what right and why are we giving them the rights and so on, I'd say that everyone has the right to have their subjectivity respected, but how we respect that is a matter of what, in Peter Singer terms, in his animal liberation, obviously he's utilitarian, not like Regan, who I usually fall on the side of. But I think like in this, he talks about ethical consideration. Now, I think ethical consideration is prior to rights anyway. When we talk about rights, we usually talk about it as having equal ethical consideration, which is why there's different forms of rights now. We'll have right to education, for example, that wasn't historically found. Like rights aren't just about like personal property or autonomy, as there would have been in the time of like John Locke. Things like right to education are very important now. Being able to access the market and have be able to participate in fair and equal transactions. It's all fundamentally based on equality. It's about understanding what necessary conditions must be met for an individual to be treated equally. And that's where I would say that rights gain substance from in the first place. So in the case of animals gaining the right to vote, well, no, they're incapable of having the capacity to vote. They're incapable of reason and have an agency. And so we don't give them the right to vote, but we do treat them as having equal ethical consideration. And Regan titles this as patienthood. Animals, children, people with severe learning disabilities have ethical patienthood, whilst we have ethical agency. So the rights that we would attribute to them would be in respect to their patienthood. We would give them the right to being kept safe and not being not endangering their lives and so on.
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
So I'm just trying to envision, because like if I give humans equal consideration to animals, right? Because of this subjectivity principle, and like these are the types of scenarios that like I'm kind of envisioning, and this is where like again like I'm like, I don't know how to resolve this, because it seems like, so this let me just give kind of the dilemma that I'm seeing here. So like, let's say that we picture two animals or two creatures drowning in a lake, right? So one of those creatures is a human. So like, let's say I'm drowning in a lake, or my son is drowning in a lake, or some other child. I don't like the sound of my son drowning. Let's make it someone else's kid. And then we'll go ahead and say that there's like there's a kitten that's drowning, or it can be a rare like a Siberian tiger or something like that, right? Like some rare creature even.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't care if it's a kitten or a Siberian. I don't see the difference, if I'm honest. But continue.
Okay, but yeah. So like, and I mean, fair enough. Like, so I'm saying like, okay, so if I had to choose who to save, in my mind, I'm like, no, I'm going to prioritize the human, and I think, and I think my reason for that I would give is probably there is a scenario where I would justify the preservation of a moral agent over the subject. And it might come down to some weird consequentialist thing in my head at that point, but that seems to that could defy the meta ethic we worked so hard to establish, right? So,
well, I mean, like you could look at it like this: would you preserve the moral agent if they were a murderer? So, like a moral agent. Let's say the moral agent only killed moral patients. So you'd only kill animals, children, disabled people. Would you preserve the the person killing disabled people, or would you preserve the kitten?
Right, and that seems somewhat like unpalatable at first, but I think like if I had to say right now, if I had like that serial murderer that was like drowning in the lake and it was a kitten, I think like my ethics, like I think I would go save the serial murderer in that
I would.
context.
I mean, me personally, I would save the kitten, but that's
Well, I wouldn't blame you.
uh,
In the moment, I wouldn't blame you.
like Hitler and a kitten are drowning in a lake. Well, oh no, what am I gonna do? It's like you know,
Yeah,
but
I
at the
mean, and
same
I think it's
time,
probably something where it's not my place to
exact
cast a
judgment.
judgment in that moment, right?
Yeah,
And so like I kind of like no, like if Hitler's drowning in a lake, I'm gonna go bring him to his to the Nuremberg trials, right?
that's fair enough. And I think
I'm gonna jump in my
that's a
time
very
machine
good
and
answer.
go. Like,
That's a very good answer. To be entirely honest with you, and I don't think I know John Locke, great grandfather liberal would be very proud of that. The central justice system,
yeah,
centralized justice. But I think that I would say that, like, one, I would say there's nothing wrong with prioritizing, let's just say having an obligation, a greater obligation to a human than an animal necessarily. Not always. I would probably prioritize, let's say, the life of my dog over the life of I don't know, some random murderer or something like that. Someone who I know is also um, committing, acts of violence or whatever like that. And also, I'd say that I've got a great duty to my dog necessarily as a member of my family.
mhm.
And I'd say this is where like deontology kind of explains things more than consequentialism. Because when you
Yeah,
pointed it out when you started at first, you were like, well, I think it's like a consequentialist thing. It kind of like it's related to agency. But then you were like, well, wait a minute, it's actually more about them being human. And if it's more about them being human in the first place, if it has something to do with humanity, I would argue that most people feel a greater obligation to humanity. I'd say feel for one, because
I noted. That's an important distinction. I got you.
but also, I think that you can argue for a greater obligation for certain individuals over others. Peter Singer doesn't think that. He thinks that anyone, so there's no difference between a child dying in front of you from starvation and seeing it and a child dying in starvation in Africa. He doesn't see a distinction there. I do. I think that an individual's proximity to you does actually have an impact in terms of your responsibility to them, in terms of the responsibilities that we are outlined in our society, in our institutions, where we may have created obligations towards one another within our society that we would protect and aid individuals so that we do not let individuals suffer. And we would consider that a crime. Like if we walk past an individual who is dying in the street, we would consider that a crime in our society. You're obligated by that deontological structure within our society. Your duty is save that person in your society. Now, there isn't that structure necessarily cross
Right.
culturally. Whether there should be or not is another question, and I think that is something that we should all absolutely raise. But in terms of our actual institutional obligations, I'll say that our obligations exist in institutions, that we should
Mhm.
respect those institutional obligations to the degree of reason. So if we realize that, oh, look, my institutional obligation here is really tied to the respect of subjectivity, and there are subjects in Africa, I think we should perpetuate this obligation further. 100%, like that's rational. Same thing could be said in terms of, in terms of, like something like certain institutions being justified or unjustified, like welfareism, like the point of welfareism in society to consider animals' welfare. Seems to be counterintuitive when we consider that we're only considering their welfare as a means to an end until they're slaughtered. So we consider that their interests only in respect to human preferences. So they still have that diminished moral responsibility. And so it comes to at odds with itself. It seems irrational. We respect animals and then we kill them. And that's why I think welfareism leads to veganism. And this happens all time and time again. And this argument in terms of institutions and how institutions in society determine our actions and our reasons for actions was an argument first made by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. It's one that's been made since by people like McIntyre, and it's one that is, I would say, is brought to fruition in Hegel's philosophy of right. And if anyone's wondering about the normative aspect of this, there's a really good paper, which I always talk about, which is Dean Moyer's Deontology and Consequentialism in Hegel's Philosophy of Right, and talking about how basically we create a deontological structure to respect subjectivity in order to maximize the amount of subjectivity we respect. If we can normalize, create certain norms and behaviors at a local, at a local level, and then moving outwards, we can basically create a structure which, when universalized, creates a Kantian kingdom of ends, which is a better scenario. Like, if everyone does not steal from one another, we don't have to worry about theft. We don't necessarily have to look towards another society and just go, how are we going to stop theft there? What we say to them is, look, do you think stealing is right and justified, and try to influence them institutionally to create that law-like structure themselves.
So that brings me to another kind of question that I have here, which is, it seems like there's some smuggled consequentialism kind of sneaking in, right? And where I'm seeing that is, like, we are really trying to maximize subjectivity, right? And so if maximize subjectivity is the end goal, and that's what we seek to maximize, like, aren't we just playing to a consequence of maximize subjectivity? And is that so wrong to do?
I don't think it's necessarily wrong. I think that where I would kind of bridge away from consequentialism is, I would say that the consequences can only really be understood through the reasons that are within our institutions which create our duties. Our duties, the rational obligations we have, exist in our institutions because of our conceptions of the consequences. They allow us to conceive of the consequences. So when I respect like another individual, and I understand that I have to be obligated to them in a certain way, I now consider them within within the consequences of my actions, which is where my duties come from in the first place. And so when it's like saying, like, oh, well, what we're trying to do is maximize subjectivity. It's the same thing. Actually, the best thing to do is, like, it's the Hegelian argument against Kant. What is this abstract right that I'm supposed to do? What is my duty? And he's like, look, your duties have to exist in a way which is rational and grounded. And it's the same thing with utilitarianism. If I said, do the greatest thing that brings the greatest good for the greatest, like, do the thing that brings the greatest good for the greatest number, respect the principle of utility, you're gonna, like, what the fuck does that mean? Like, and I'm gonna have to explain to you, the people have all these different aspects of their lives, and you're not going to get anywhere, because everything's going to seem overly complex, and you're going to realize you're a single agent acting in such a way as to only bring around certain ends. But more than that, your conception of what good is, your conception of what rightness is, has already been preconceived within you. You need to actually engage with that notion of rightness, engage with your obligations, to question it, to bring it to the point in which the reasons within that notion of rightness are challenged, its validity is challenged, its soundness is challenged within your life, and then you need to restructure that duty and then perpetuate it outwards. And I think this is exactly what happens in society. We get taught what is right and wrong from our parents. We have autonomous morality until about the age of 12, where we start thinking autonomously and start trying to conceive of what we ought to do in our lives, try to be independent, rebel against our parents, and cause them live in hell. And then we're by the end of it, we'll become adults, hopefully, and try to act as maturely as possible. We realize the faults of what our parents have taught us. We realize what advantages have come from them. We see the good that they've taught us. We see the logical inadequacies of what they've taught us. And we pass on the good to our children, who then do exactly the same to us.
So another dumb question, also returning to a previous point, because I think that's also important to note, the societal kind of obligations, like the way that this kind of works out, right? When we all take these individual actions, it kind of combines into this collective action that's going to be formulating society, how we see it, and creating these relationships and institutions where our duties seem to be a part of, right? And so I wanted to return to that note on exploitation in the definition here, and I wanted to ask that question of, is this like what do we mean by exploitation? Is this like a Marxist kind of definition of exploitation, where it's just like the maximize? Okay.
I would use Kantian. I would say to use using people as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. Treating people as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. So, like, using them as a means to fulfill a given hypothetical, ethical or moral, rather than treating them as the end of moral discussion.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, and then in that sense, because I think that I think that like there's that Kantian point too of like, hey, look, like, yeah, we should be treating each other as ends and recognizing, or rather recognizing each other as ends. But there are times where we do use each other for means. So like I recognize you in this conversation as another rational mind with important ideas to share with me. And this is how you and I are maximizing our subjectivity right now. We're having this exchange of ideas. And I think that's a very ethical thing to do. I think that, in fact, I think it's objectively ethical to do. It's objectively the right move that we should be having these conversations on these difficult matters. Like we need to do this.
Can't actually agree with you. Actually, we made the same argument. He basically said that we are obligated to talk about ethics and challenge authority in what he called private time, basically. But like it means like publicly doing it. But then at work, we need to maintain the structure of society, and so don't go absolutely destroying society from which we need to engage in. And that was his kind of his argument in that as well. And I think Hegel and so on takes it to another degree where he's like, look, like you actually to even fulfill your institutional mandate, like to do the things that you are engaged in the first place, you're going to start reasoning this just in performing these obligations within the workplace, in whatever institution it is, whether it's like medicine, school, like the family even. And in this, you're going to start challenging this doctrine, and you're going to have to start producing new doctrine in relationship to other individuals. You're going to have to come up with new doctrine together. And I think that this is where, if we hold this principle, like, look, what we are trying to do is maximize maximize the ends, people being treated as an end in themselves, maximize the expression of subjectivity. Then when we engage in these institutional, rational kind of critique, we see the flaws and we repair them. We see like, okay, well, this is good, this isn't good. And it allows us to essentially universalize it. And I think that Kant made some really strong points. I think, and Hegel is almost pretty much Kantian, except for the fact that he understands it to be more institutional and far more akin to Aristotle. He understands the end, the telos, as being vitally important. And he said that this, they said that this is not a consequentialism. It's like, no, it's like to have a deontological position in the first place. There's no sense in divorcing intention away from consequences. It doesn't make sense. What are you intending to produce is such a vital question to whether it's like, when you are engaged in that action, what was the consequences you were trying to bring around? Now, if someone can't tell you them, then they're not acting rationally, usually. Like if you go like, well, why did you do that? And they're like, I just don't know. like a lot of the time you're like, well, this is a bad sign. And I think this is, I think that's why you say like, oh, we're not smuggling in consequentialism. I don't think so. I think that when we look at things like consequentialism, virtue ethics, and deontology, the form, they get much closer together when you see the academic literature, when it gets perfected, when people start arguing more and more for why the need to, how we should engage in ethical life. You get things that are called, like, for example, perfect utilitarianism, where they start arguing about the behaviors and habits of individuals in order to produce the ideal consequences. You get, deontological structures like threshold deontology, which argue that the consequences inform our duties, and so on. The distinction between these positions really starts to break down considerably, like the more you get into the literature.
That's been kind of what I've been finding too. Like, and then also when you start to look at a lot of the more, I guess, like contemporary scholars, right, on ethics, like Rochelle's and such, right, you start to see these like kind of hodgepodge systems where any reference to I'm a 3-in-1 system is kind of more like a cursory. I guess I would say like it's a very rudimentary, like kind of 101 explanation to someone. So like, yeah, I think consequences do matter. We need to talk about them. I think the actions matter. I think intent matters. I think your character matters. And it's like, it's really normal for, I think, those of us who talk ethics a lot to be like, yeah, we kind of adopt these and then we give these systems names, but then it's kind of like, yeah, like the consequences matter, but it's not a consequentialism. And so now we're just kind of, I don't want to say it's a mere verbal dispute, because I think at the higher level, it's not that. But like, I think when we have like the teacher to student kind of relationship, a lot of the time it is just like, hey, like, I'm an undergrad. My philosophy language is not going to be as well developed as yours. So I'm going to need, a little bit of help and assistance getting to those terms. Right. And making sure that I'm using the words as you understand them to mean, you know what I mean? So
exactly. and that's essentially it as well. Like the amount in which you engage in this really does change how you really perceive them in the first place. So, like for example, I call myself deontologist because I start from reason to consequences. Whilst I would argue that a lot of consequentialists, like utilitarians, start from they don't start from the principle and reason. They start from the understanding of the value, which is consequential in relation to the life of subjectivity, and then that's presumed, and then they move back. You see, I think that it's got to be dialectically prior, and that's why I would say that Hegel is first a deontologist who considers, the consequences. But then, yeah, you're right. Like these debates, like they'll go on forever. I mean, talk about 3-in-1 systems. I mean, like Derek Parfit, like triple theory and stuff. There are so many like hodgepodge systems, as you say. It does like in terms of like higher level ethics, it does like you'll find that almost every ethical system will contain some notion of virtue or deontology and consequentialism, like almost always, unless they're just anti-realists or something like and things like that. But they don't count.
I'm inclined to agree. When they can believe that they count just as much as they don't count, then I will count them the same way. So
exactly.
yeah. So okay. So this is the picture that I'm trying to kind of paint for myself now. So we have this start of the subjectivity is what matters. We can acknowledge that there are key and critical capacity differences between humans and animals, but that those capacity differences don't invalidate an ethical treatment of the animal at all. And so I think you and I can agree on all of this so far. We should still treat the animals ethically, even if they lack human capacities, in the same way that I might treat much in the same way, I should say, where I would treat humans that have diminished capacities, say someone's born brain dead or without a brain. I would still regard their life with value. I think so. So where I go at this point normally in my mind is I kind of go, okay, yeah, I can see that. But the reason that I don't kill that human, even if they were this kind of like marginal case that's really similar to an animal, is that like it actually for me it does kind of come down to practicality. Because at that point I'm kind of saying, well, look, if I set a standard where killing this human is okay for food pleasure right here, and then I'm looking at like the body of laws and what I need this justice system to actually be in order to be reasonable to begin with, right? I would see a justice system that falls apart.
Yeah, it's the principle that if normalized can lead to other unethical conclusions, even if this action is not unethical, it right. Can be, once it's universalized, it can lead to worse conclusions, which I think is like absolutely. It's like that's why I think a lot of the time, severe ethical like like reductions, where you take someone and you put them in a trolley problem that's just absolutely like right. Like to be fair, like, and I'm not being critical of name the trait again, but there was I remember one discussion was with Stefan Molyneux, and it was Stefan who was being just as bad. Like Stefan Molyneux. Like if I'm gonna call anyone like if I don't use the word sophist a lot, but Stefan Molyneux is a sophist, man. Like it's not like I'm saying like it was never gonna be a good faith conversation, right? And
yeah,
but then at the same time, they're asking him hypotheticals, and some of the hypotheticals were like, like he got it to the point in which it was like wizards, and he's like, you're asking me if wizards existed, like, blah blah blah, but he's the one that framed it like that in the first place. But whatever, like asking a hypothetical about wizards doesn't seem to be the best way to engage in ethical discourse. It's like, right, well, if Harry Potter was real, then yeah, the rules of the game change, but Harry Potter's not real, so can we move on?
Right.
And I think that's the case. It's like, well, yeah, like, look, if animals actually were zombies and didn't have sentience, and we knew that for a fact, it would change things. Same with people. Same with other, like, whatever else we're talking about. Like, if we knew AI was going to be sentient, or something like that, you can literally, add ad hoc any like like situation that can invalidate. So I remember doing this. I think it was actually at A level when we talked about whether it makes sense to talk about the ethics of a system in extreme circumstances. And there's a philosopher, I can't remember their name, who argued that it's just the worst way of approaching. Like some people like hypothetics, hypothetical. Some people some people love them, some people hate them, but they have that place. But ultimately, I don't think finding out like an actual ethical conclusion, you can rely purely on hypothetical circumstances. It's kind of like
I'm inclined to agree.
I kind of like, actually, to give an example, said the cow comes up to me and they're like, milk me,
Right.
please, I'm in so much pain. I just artificially get pregnant from like God impregnates me and I suddenly produce milk or something like that. I would say that is like not a situation that I would say is possibly being ethical. But like, if we indulge the scenario more, so if we try to make it more real, so if we say like, look, the cow, like, are you like, if I was to ask you like, how is this cow getting pregnant? How would you respond?
Well, I mean, I know the process is artificial insemination right now, but I'm trying to figure out the difference between like, so I've heard the vegan argument that that's rape, and one of the issues I am trying to figure out is how artificial insemination is rape because the cow can't consent, but then also a bull having a bull mating with the cow is not rape when the cow can't necessarily consent to that either. And like,
I suppose the difference we would argue would be whether the cow's resistance to the bull or not. So, for example, does it cause harm to the cow?
right.
I think, like for example, it's not simply the act of artificial insemination; it's the fact that cows have to be tied down and will resist and don't want it to happen. A lot of the time. Another argument I think that could be made is that a bull is not a moral agent and so could not be held accountable. It is rape, but it's not capable of rape, so it can't actually do it.
We would still call the action wrong, though, right? Like if that was the case, like wouldn't we still call that wrong?
We'd call it like a natural evil if it was
Right.
causing. But I don't think it necessarily is, because I don't think that cows are all like in suffering because bulls are having sex with them. Like, I don't think that's what goes on. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't really engage in research working out whether cows enjoy sex with bulls. But
I mean, fuck, man, me either. Like,
but I'm assuming that cows aren't necessarily. I know that like it's kind of iffy with cats with that like serrated dicks and stuff, and we can definitely, we need to do something about that. But
yeah.
but like in terms of cows, I don't know what goes on there. Like I mean, that's a cow's business, right? But like whether it's causing suffering is what I would say that is it's in relation to. And I think one of the big things is that we know pregnancy comes with its risks. It comes with like the risks of disease. It comes with the risks of even death. And obviously, we also have the production of another life, of whether it's a good idea to produce another life, who is then dependent upon us or its mother, who we then have to look after. And also, are we going to allow that calf to drink the milk? If we're not going to allow that calf to drink the milk, then how are we removing the calf from its mother? If we're removing the calf from its mother, are we defying the maternal bond between calf and cow, which causes
Right.
the stress? And there is all these factors to consider before we even get on to the point of milking.
Yeah, and I'm inclined to agree with that. And pardon me, I'm my chat's telling me the volume's a little low on us both, so I'm just trying to check really quick. Is that good?
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure. Let me know, chat, if that's good. We're gonna keep talking. Other people have been okay, so I think we can continue. But yeah, I think you're onto something there, which is like we have these animal interactions. We do have this natural evil, but we don't have to choose to participate in it, right? And so like when we talk about these ethical farming practices, like maybe like it is going to be the case that what pans out is ultimately going to be this kind of beyond beef situation and switching to these other substitutes for en masse, so that we don't deal with this factory farming craziness, right? And then we don't have this like artificial insemination. We don't have all of these other moral issues now that have been previously associated with farming, right? And so if we can get to that point, and I think now maybe now is a good time to ask the implementation questions that I have, because I think like overall it's like, yeah, if we could do this in a way that is ultimately causing less suffering, acknowledging that that's good, to avoid suffering as a general principle, right? Then sure, like let's do that. So the first implementation question I would have is is it possible for me to respect is it possible for me to respect something that I kill? And my answer right now is yes. So an example of that respect, if we're defining respect as a regard for the subjectivity and everything of the other, right? If we're good with that, I think the example where I could respect what I kill is like if I had kind of a bit of like a sacred or perhaps spiritual connection to a circle of life. So we might have, say, like the Native American tribes that would say a prayer to the bear and the bear spirit or whatever before they would come out and slay it, right? And then they would eat it, and that's one example. I think another example may be like if I'm a soldier in a combat environment, let's say, and while I am in a survival environment, I can respect that what my actions are doing. Like these people have families on the other end, and because of that, how I conduct this action, of defensive violence or even offensive violence, I limit it and I curtail it in certain ways. My respect becomes embodied in that action as I carry it out. And so
yeah
and so like I don't kill the person and then their family, right? I instead of, in that context, I kind of transition what I think of from I'm trying to kill the enemy to I'm incapacitating a threat, right? And that's typically the language you hear with ethical self-defense. Is it's not about killing, it's about incapacitation, and typically reliable incapacitation, which is why in America, we get guns. So
yeah
I mean they're pretty effective.
I mean that's actually like kind of like if we're honest, I think if we looked at the actual industrial like the what's it called, the industrial military complex of the United States and every other country in the world, I think we know that's not the case. I mean, if we look at something like anti-personnel ammo, if we look at something like the rejection of alternative forms of weaponry, for example, they made a gun that would blind people temporarily. I'm pretty sure that was rejected by the U.S. military. The U.S. military is not in the business of necessarily saving lives. Don't get me wrong. I think that like everyone, pretty much every nation needs a military. I'm not one of those people that thinks that we can just get rid of abolish the military, defund the military, because it's like haha, and then somebody doesn't and someone fucking invades you. So like yeah, I get it. Like it's not as clean cut as just we're just going to assume everyone's going to be great. Right,
yeah, like there's cost implementations too, right? Because to stop a threat with 5.56, in the civilian market, that's going to cost you about 50 cents for the army, it's going to cost them about $600 to $800 for the rifle, right? Yeah. So like if you look at that, and the training cost is very low, and if you compare that to a lot of the other means, like I worked in psychological operations, so I was a bit of the U.S. Army wants you to know that they don't create propaganda, they create media products, and that there's a big difference. But that was what I did, right? And so I was a propaganda man for the U.S. Army, and we would also though be involved in what we call psychological action. So for instance, our secondary, or you could say even our primary weapon system could be argued to be our loudspeaker, our voices, right? Hey, civilians, stay inside. We don't want you to get involved in this. Hey, we're going to be over here conducting operations. Do not approach us or you're going to get shot. Like, we cannot have you come by. And that type of thing, well, paradoxically, you have a military operating in terrain and in and of itself that can create lethal risk to civilians and to enemy fighters in that area, right? Because that's just the name of the game. Right. But on the other side, yeah, we're minimizing collateral, right? And so they use terms like a combat multiplier or a force multiplier to kind of describe what we're doing. And we're doing it with, non-lethal means. And that loudspeaker we can use for crowd control as well. And there's also other devices and stuff that we had access to that for non-lethal crowd control, I guess, same as like police do in the US. And again, not to say that these devices don't have their own ethical issues, right?
No,
but
that's a great example. I mean, police in the United States, they're taught their first use of force is their arrival on the scene. It's like literally just being like having a police officer there is a use of force. They know that, like just being able to give commands like stay where you are is a use of force. And I think that's the best way to look at it. But I think that like if you compare like trying to minimize harm there, like the police rock up, it's pretty much, it should be. I mean, obviously what we've seen in terms of every single nation in the world is that the police don't always do the right thing. Oh, what a surprise! Oh my God, that could
100%, right?
you know, and same with the military, same with every, yeah, shit. Doctors don't do the right thing sometimes. We don't necessarily talk about, you know, like Dr. Shipman and so on being like, we do actually talk about him, but we don't talk about, you know, medical negligence as much as we talk about, you know, police negligence and so on. So it gets political real quick. But the things that obviously it's very important to recognize that use of force obviously is in relation to, I think, obviously respect of subjectivity. It should always be, we use force in order to respect subjectivity.
Yeah, and I'm with that.
But in the case of, like, let's say, like, I'm probably fairly controversial on this. I don't believe in this pray to the bear spirit, you can go and slaughter something kind of nonsense. One, because I don't see a reason why their tradition would justify their action, for the same reason that I don't see the Native Americans being slaughtered by the Americans for their tradition was justified. I don't care if the British and Americans prayed before they gave smallpox-laced blankets to the Native Americans. It was wrong. You know, it doesn't matter because it was the direct rejection of subjectivity, but it was in relation to an abstract form of right, which made them feel like it was good. They made them think as if it was good. And this is where I think that I don't like the woman, and I want to stress this, I really hate our political philosophy. I dislike her very much. But Ayn Rand makes a very good point here, where she says basically almost every ethical system in the world is subjective. They're not actually considering what is objective in and of itself. They haven't actually taken the time to ground that system in the first place. Praying to a bear spirit has no ethical significance, I would argue, in terms of whether it actually respects the subjectivity of the bear or not. The bear's subjectivity wouldn't even necessarily be the same as the bear spirit. And even if it was, like, how do you even know that this is going to, like, why would this justify taking the bear's life? Why can't you just pray to the bear spirit and then go and eat a carrot? Like, I don't necessarily necessarily endorse this position. And if we look at tradition, and I think the worst part of this is that people call you pro-colonialist if you say that you reject this notion of indigenous hunting rights. And the way I see it is that the indigenous populations, like what I would like to try and point out to the indigenous populations is that this is wrong. And I think that they have cultural ownership to the point of the same as their ancestors. They aren't defined by the tradition that was annihilated by us 3 centuries ago. We don't have to keep them in a 3 century year old out of date system in order to make them authentic. Their authenticity is in their tradition, in their engagement within it. And if they want to change it because it's more rational not to kill a sentient being, then they can do that. I mean, one of the greatest examples is Hinduism used to kill, like Hinduism and religions in that area of the world used to kill animals for sacrifice. But then they started sacrificing flowers when Sikhism came around. I think it was Sikhism Sikhism or Buddhism. I think it was Sikhism that came around then. They started sacrificing flowers. I mean, it's rare that some people do still animal sacrifice, but a lot of the time it's like flowers now. And I don't have a problem with people giving flowers to temples, like putting flowers on temples. I do have a problem with people slitting a goat's throat. And that I think that's the big difference. The reality of the situation is that when I'm critical of this endeavor, it's for the same reason that I would be critical of people disregarding their land rights, or the same reason I'd be critical of people disregarding their, native of their traditions and their culture in the first place. It's because I respect them and I respect the animal. I'm respecting subjectivity from which they all partake. And if they're doing something which does not respect subjectivity, then when they are engaged in their prayer or something like that, they may feel as if they are respecting it. They may believe they are respecting it. But if I can present a rational argument to go, look, you are actually actively undermining the subjectivity of that animal because it is resisting and you are not taking that into account, and instead taking a concept separate towards the animal and making it equivocal with the animal for no justified reason, can you give me like an argument why this would be acceptable? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that we should all engage in multicultural rational discourse. I want to say that FGM's wrong. I don't think female genital mutilation, it's not right. Like girls getting like mutilated in foreign countries is not acceptable. I don't care if it's culturally accepted or not. I don't think that people losing their hands in foreign countries for thieving is a good idea either,
Right.
and so on. I think there are certain things where for example, Assad, I think it was Assad, wasn't it, with using white phosphorus on his population. Like
Mhm.
we don't accept certain things cross culturally as like, oh, it's okay, it's their traditions. They commit war crimes, you know.
Right. Yeah. And I'm inclined to agree with that. And I think you may have won me over at least to some extent. And so I think I'll ask like I think I only have two more questions, really, to just kind of like pick your brain a little bit more. So
Yep.
the first question is going to be on sustainability and approaching like things like quote unquote invasive species, right? So
That is a bit of
I
a
could
that is
right. It can be nuanced, right? But like in the case of and this is what I've heard from the vegans I've talked to so far. So if there's anything, feel free to correct that record as well on your take. But what I've been hearing is listen. So our feral hog problem in Texas, right? So we have the farmers need to put up fences and need to do like auditory distractions and need to lure with food and other things, get these hogs off of the property, terrain controls, things like that. And once they do that, that should solve the problem. Then if it doesn't, and it is a threat to crops, to people being able to get their food, to children playing outside or whatever. Okay, go ahead and defend yourself. We don't really have a problem, but exhaust that. And I think if I was talking to a farmer in Texas who is hearing that, they're like, dude, I've done that. Right. Like I think they're sitting there and they're like, I've tried everything. If I could not have to deal with this hog problem, I would prefer that, but these hogs are costing me thousands of dollars in damage a year. Like as far as the bottom line, and I'm a broke ass farmer. Um, I've got all of these issues going on with that, and then plus the risk to myself, the risk to my property, everything else. So yeah, I kind of have to go out and do something about that. Do you think that there could be an ethical case for any hunting, like in that regard of
I think that
certain types of pest control, or if there's a species that was going to eradicate another species, like is there perhaps a more nuanced conversation with hunting we should be having?
well, I think that probably. I think that the one of the things that really like so one with invasive species, eradicating native species. I don't care if I'm honest, unless it causes like some sort of like greater overall harm to like by destabilizing the ecology of the system and it collapses and like causing ecological collapse and millions of animals will starve and so on. I don't necessarily care. I like, for example, the gray squirrel versus the red squirrel. We have the red squirrel. The American gray squirrel came over. It's bigger and it's better than the gray squirrel. It's just more evolved in terms of better suited for our environment, and so it takes all the food, and the red squirrel's not able to compete with it. Um, I like red squirrels. That doesn't mean I'm gonna kill a gray squirrel because I like looking at them. You know, it's
Right.
just that this idea of like species preservation is always about aesthetic value. Like it's a snow leopard. I don't care. Nobody talks about like the millions of bugs that get eradicated in the Amazon. Like, oh, snow leopards are going to go extinct, but they look so pretty. Like what kind of discourse is this? Like, that's not the value. Like, I don't value something's life simply because of
Fair
how
enough.
good it looks.
Yeah.
Um, and then in terms of genuine moral harm, like something murdering your child because you weren't there, like, or something like that, and so you got to protect it with by shooting the threat from preventing the threat from your child. That's different. I think that's totally justifiable. If someone was on your property or some sort of rabid animal or something like that is on your property and you need to protect you and your family, try non-lethal if you can. If you can't, then kill it. Yeah, fair enough. I'm not going to argue against that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that it's the rule of double effect. You're trying to protect your family, and in trying to protect your family, you've had to take the life of another. If someone broke into my house, I'm probably going to either like incapacitate them or murder them. That is the ideal. There's no middle ground. Like I'm not going to go, oh well, like, would you please leave? I'm going to assume that they're very hostile because I'm in a situation that if I don't assume they're hostile, me and my family could get killed. So
Yeah.
I'll use any means necessary in order to protect me and my family, and I think that's absolutely acceptable.
Yeah, and my rough argument is roughly the same too. So like I would say like hey, look, in the self-defense situation, the reality is that my duties have now been downsized, right? So like what's the Spider-Man quote, Uncle Ben, right? Great power, great responsibility. So I think there is a correlation there, right?
Uncle
And so
Ben, what a
yeah,
he's actually it's actually I use that exact quote all the time.
yeah, based Uncle Ben. But yeah, like, but that's more or less my point. Is that like, hey, look, now my power has been downsized because I can't influence other things. I'm stuck in this situation where it's me or them, right? And so now my duty has become to myself.
I think that's exactly where the discourse needs to be taken in terms of political action. If you recognize that the individual farmer is not being able to, neutralize what is a threat. I mean, like, let's be honest, the farmer should not have to deal with this threat in the first place. So having this threat engage with them, if we could minimize it, then even better. So there needs to be political action on that. If they are, and we need farmers. I mean, horticultural farmers, not agricultural, like animal agricultural farmers. I'm not going to lie. I want them out of business. I want them to switch over to something that's, more horticultural. Grow potatoes, carrots, or something. Stop farming animals. And if you can't, then you've got a lot of land that you can use for something else. It's it's just the way of things. Like certain industries die, and they can be replaced. And you can even get people who argue for using land for sustainability projects and so on like that. Trying to rewild land and stuff like that. I'm not sure how I feel about that in terms of wild suffering and stuff, which gets messy and complicated in and of itself. But in terms of definitely prefer something like that over animal agriculture. But in terms of the individual being an animal agricultural farmer, I think that is something perverse about killing an animal in order to protect your capacity to kill animals. And I know that it's obviously institutional. I know that people don't realize that doing this and it's causing the harm that it is. It's like that. Jesus on the cross, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. I think that it's the same thing as how I would look at a farmer shooting a boar or something like that because they've come onto that property trying to save that sheep or whatever, which they are then going to send to slaughter. They're not considering the boar in the first place, and they're not considering the sheep in the first place enough to the point in which it's actually an ethical interaction. And then
that's an interesting argument. Let me give me just a second. I want to process that because I think that's actually really cool that you said that. That was noteworthy to me. They're not considering the sheep, say in the first place, or whatever their cattle or whatever with this boar problem, because of how the boar's already been treated, right? And so, or because of how that cattle's already been treated and what its purpose is to them and their intent with it and everything. And so the argument is, hey, look, when they're killing the boar to protect the crop or to protect their animals, right? It's kind of like, hey, man, we know why you're killing it, and you're killing it so that you get to be the one that kills this, and that's still jacked up in your view.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So,
I mean, it's to protect themselves and their livelihood, not the animal. And so it's engaged in a form of whether what we have to ask in the first place is this industry justified? Are you justified in engaging in this practice within the market? And I think that this is why political action is so important, because it demarcates the limits of the market. We don't sell slaves on the market anymore because we believe that it's wrong. Same thing as we don't allow for certain items to be sold in the market because we see it's dangerous and exploitative. And I think that it's the same thing with veganism. I think veganism is a private enterprise. I think, I'm surprised the libertarians don't like it because it's the private limitation of the market based on an individual's capacity to understand a moral argument. So, going and saying, look, we've created an institution which verifies a product as vegan or not vegan, in order to essentially create a market limitation. I'll only endorse products which are labeled vegan, and I mean that in terms of course veggies and stuff. You don't have to
right.
about that, but contentious stuff labeled as vegan allows me to essentially endorse a market that I think is justified and unjustified, and it gives greater agency to those individuals within the marketplace. And so it's the private it's the individualistic limitation of the market. It's individual non-governmental political action, which I would have thought libertarians would at least like the concept of.
I actually, that is something that I rail on too, because there's a lot of concepts where there's things like, hey guys, unions, right? Unions are representing your interests in where? The marketplace of where you work. Like maybe you should be pro-union a little bit, right? That doesn't mean you have to endorse every union action that's ever happened. Like unions have gone really wrong in America in a lot of ways, but there's a
Yeah.
lot of really good things that they've done too. And we can look to that and say, hey, look, your labor is being exploited by these corporations and it gets devalued over time. And this is an issue. And it's really nice that you can work together in the market to control the price of your labor when the corporations get to do that the opposite way to you. It's really nice for you to have a vehicle where you can resist that and be treated how you should be valued. So that way you can not feel like you're completely alienated from your labor, to use a particular philosopher's.
I was going to say, I wonder who thought of that. I think like 100%, like I completely agree. I think that the only thing I have with unions is that in an economic sense, and this is probably the market socialist coming out in this, I think that it doesn't actually cause it doesn't give a solution to the problem. Because let's say you had a union which managed to give workers massively increased rights to the point in which it causes an issue for the corporation, which is what a lot of the libertarian sort of people try to point out. That like, look, it leads to like the limitation of profits, which then prevent the organization from, working effectively and so on and so forth, and economic arguments, like pragmatic arguments. There is something there though in one respect. I'm doing me wrong. I think that American unions need to grow. That painfully small. Like unionism in America is so unbelievably dead that I don't think that you're gonna have to worry about market destabilization because your unions don't exist. So I think like in terms of like getting better rights for employees is a necessity. But at the same time, the liberalism, like obviously I know you're a liberal, but the liberalism in unionization only tries to medicate what is a bad problem. And the issue is that if an individual was an owner in a worker cooperative or something like that, they would then be able to go, look, what are we being paid and why? Does this make economic sense for the corporation? Would I be willing to sacrifice getting paid in order to maintain this business within the marketplace? If I know it's essential or not, and they can make these decisions in terms of and then that way when we talk about trades and actually engaged in in economics, the problem is unions sometimes seem detached, and obviously corporations are incredibly inconsiderate. They act only for profit. So you've got one side acting only for people and one side acting only for profit. And what we really need is someone acting in a self-interest within their own organization, or in mutual interest in an organization, where you go, wait a minute, what is mutually beneficial here? And that's the union between those two poles, which are contentiously fighting, I think, in the atypical union versus corporation format within capitalism. And that's why I would argue for something more akin to market socialism. But
yes.
And
I don't want to get totally off track there. Although I think we could have a wonderful conversation on that could educate me a lot, because I'm not too big on economic philosophy. I understand like a little bit, but it's not my area. And also I want to. I need to loads of I know we kind of digress. I made the union note, so that is my fault. But yeah, on the note of like the implementation, because capitalism is, for lack of a better term, just a bitch. It's going to be a thorn in our side. This is probably a speciesist and sexist term. I apologize, chat. But it is kind of the thorn in our side as we try to do all of this, right? Because we do have, and this is the final implementation question we have. So it's a perfect segue. Because that political action does matter, I agree with you. It seems strange to me that we can say on one hand, okay, well, personally, someone can adopt veganism today, right? Like you could go out and become a vegan today. And that's totally reasonable. And for most people in like the US or Europe, right, that's going to be feasible for them. They have the budget to do that. The options exist in the market, right? But then we kind of get I think it's the Downs paradox, where like the more people do it, the more people get kind of excluded and alienated. We kind of see that there's only so much in the way of vegan products currently on the market. So if everyone transitioned to veganism tomorrow and simply refused to eat meat products, we'd have a whole bunch of people just revert back for survival needs and stuff. So it's like, okay, it makes sense to incrementally do it. But then on the other side of that, I'm going, man, like if this is mass extermination, or not extermination, but just mass killing, let's say, mass torture, this horrendous evil, it seems so strange to me to be like, yeah, man, let's just let the market, kind of work its course, and we'll eventually become more ethical over time as people kind of enlighten themselves to this issue.
Hmm.
And we'll just slowly stop the mass killing. That's good enough, right? And it's like that seems so strange to say as a society.
Yeah, but I mean, the reality of the situation is that's all you can do within a democratic environment is try and rationally convince others. I think that in terms of like, so for look at it like this, like we could like we can create movements and political movements and so on that are against racism, that are against sexism, that are against like horrific acts of violence all over the world. But the reality of the situation is you can't force moral progress. Moral progress is a rational endeavor engaged by agents for the benefit of, for mutual advantage. And it's not something that we can, perpetuate and then force another to do. And I think a good example is something like, like many of us would probably agree that women's rights were probably better in Iran, post-revolution. Women were being treated in a way that was probably more respectful for their autonomy. I mean, I don't know very much about the history there, but from what I'm aware, that women were given more consideration in Iran before it became theocratic when it was under the Shah, and obviously that was a very American influence. And so, because it was such an American influence and such a Western influence, it was rejected. They revolted, and went so theocratic now that women are being put in prison for refusing to wear a hijab on the train, and like it's like 25 or 30 years in prison, giving out flowers as a form of protesting they're having to wear hijabs, and they're getting put in like prison for like 30 years, like sentences we would give murderers.
Right. No,
and
it's insane. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we would see that as an ethical regression. But that regression's happened because we've tried to force what we believe to be moral progress. And what they've seen is cultural influence, and they've rejected it. They felt as it's a master-slave dialectic. They felt that they're getting told what to do. They don't see the reasons for why we are engaging in this discourse in the first place. And what we should have done is, rather than try to perpetuate a norm and say, like, look, you should do it like this, and, work through that sort of thing, open up discourse is what needs to happen, so that the population can think for themselves. And so they go, well, wait a minute, I don't want to imprison people for protesting the hijab. That's nonsense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's why moral discourse is so important. I think as well, in terms of implementation, in terms of the marketplace, a slow implementation is more than likely in any ways. It's just the way that I think it will happen. And I think it's, people say, well, what would happen to all the animals? And it's like, well, let's be honest, all of those animals are going to die. It's probably like a few generations from now where we'll start to see the diminishing numbers actually, come down small enough to the point in which, we're starting to see real destabilization of the meat, dairy, and egg industries. And it's not anytime soon. And specifically for the fact that even politically, we're going to have to essentially make a massive political action just to remove subsidies for animal agriculture. Otherwise, because it's not been profitable for a long time now. Like, for example, in the UK, under CAP, 60% of profits for dairy farmers was through subsidies, farming subsidies, from the European Union. And we're changing that now, and it's actually changing. It might actually be a bit better. But the reality is it's not very profitable. They need those subsidies because of the price of milk. Otherwise, the price of milk would be so high, people would be alienated from the market anyway, and the product probably wouldn't exist, at least not in the way that it does. People wouldn't be drinking it because it would be so expensive. The true cost of the products is totally alienated from the consciousness of the average everyday individual, because of farm subsidies. So there needs to be massive political action there in the first place, in anyways. And then, but alienating, like changing consumer habits, stopping people drinking and eating and consuming these products, ultimately will end up ramming the price of the product through the roof anyway. Because as demand decreases, they're going to have to essentially reduce supply, and they're going to have to maintain profitability. And to maintain profitability, they're going to have to sell it for higher prices, and you're going to see it spiral off anyway. That's essentially what happens when businesses become essentially non-consumed. Like you start seeing, but eventually you'll have a very small animal agricultural business where because the animals, like take for example a cow, it's like one of the longest living animals, lives for 5 years before it's slaughtered in animal agriculture, and that's like a dairy cow. These animals are going to be long dead by the time we even get there. And by the time we do get there, the populations will be much lower, and then we can talk about what would be the right thing to do in this scenario, because we have so many thousands, or like hundreds of thousands of animals versus the 70
Right.
billion that we currently have. Actually, more than 70 billion. That's how many are killed every year. So
Yeah.
there's that to consider. Like the reality of the situation is that we should do what we can to prevent this from going on, and that I think that just means changing people's habits one step at a time and getting them to listen to reason. Just going like, look, like, do you think this is okay? It's like, it's kind of like when you're talking like in terms of the gun debate in the United States. You wouldn't just approach people and go, we're taking your guns off you, because that's going to end in civil war. You know, you don't do
know
that.
how many times I've tried to tell the anti-gunners I'm for the repeal of the National Firearms Act, by the way. You have no idea how many times I've told anti-gunners, yeah, good luck.
Well, that's
You're not getting them.
that's the thing. Like
Yeah.
you have to just have like the political discourse, and I think that I think one of the problems of our society, one of the greatest problems of our society, is essentially the fragmentation between, like, whether it's political extremes, like, you know, liberals and conservatives in the United States is huge, or like, you know, like whether it's, was it Republican, Democrat, and here it's Labor and conservative, but then there are so many different factions in society, always listening to their own discourse without considering, you know, essentially external and even internal critique. That they just assume that any external critique is propaganda, and they don't listen to it. You know, you read the New York Times, and so I know that the New York Times has posted these articles, which is untrue, and all it is a propaganda piece. And then you're like, you read the Fox News, like you listen to Fox News, and that is just a big heap of propaganda. And it's like, look, a lot of the time are both right. You're actually both full of shit. You know, it's the same thing as the political discourse over here. I say it all the time. I'm like, the only thing that we'll ever get right is the fact that we're both wrong. And like a lot of the time, if we just took the second to listen to each other's arguments and to engage in the kind of reasoning that we're actually engaged with, then we would probably get a lot further. And if anyone's interested in the discourse on this topic, there's an author called Alistair McIntyre who brings up these points in a few books. He brings this up in After Virtue, where he talks about what ethics is, or in general, which is a brilliant book for anyone who's interested in ethics. And more political books on this. He brings it up in Three Rival Modes of Rationality and Whose Justice and Which Rationality. So yeah, if anyone's interested in like the political divisions and how it spawns from different ethical reasoning, that's really great reads. So yeah.
So I guess it might be a good time to kind of start bringing this to a close, because I do have a get together with my professor. So with that being said, I think you won me over on a couple points, actually. So I'm actually really happy we had this discussion. I think you won me over on dairy consumption. And the particular problems with that, because I think that's something that I've mostly phased out anyway, just for I don't want to say I'm lactose intolerant, but I also don't think dairy sits well with me for the most part. So it's been,
I think that was me as well, to be honest. Like I can digest it, I'm pretty sure, but it was never the best thing.
Cheese is okay, but like I don't like milk anyway. So like it's one of those things where, but I can live without it. I think where I'm not convinced yet is probably on the sustainability issues with like invasive species and hunting. But I think that's a more I think that would probably launch us off into probably about 3 hours of particulars that I'm not ready to engage in, because I don't know all of them. But I'm just
fair enough. I think that there's arguments that have yet to be even dealt with. Like, for example, the implementation of gene drives is a new thing that we can talk about. Like, so the genetic modification of species and so on to not reproduce or not have as many offspring and so on, which is like a game changer. Like they're talking about doing this to mosquitoes as well to prevent the spread of
like
malaria, yeah, stuff like that. There's like loads of stuff. Like technology, I think, will probably be the solution in the end. You know, we'll science our way out of it somehow.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that continued development and continued thought like does ultimately improve this space over time, because I think like maybe there still are some ethical ways to hunt, particularly like invasive species. Like, you know, like we have hog hunting as a thing, and perhaps it could be for that. You know, perhaps there is some ethical consumption that is non-exploitative of animal products that we can discuss, where like, you know, we might be talking like the roadkill type of thing, right? Where
like
if you want to do that, Right. Yeah. Like or eggs from hens that aren't factory farm hens that you purchased to be egg mills. Maybe you just you did rescue hens or
Yeah, I
you
was going
found
to say
feral
like
chickens and raised them or something.
I'm glad you knew about the hens being necessarily like if that made.
I did. I listened to your stream yesterday.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. I was throwing out dumb questions because at the end of the day, really what matters is we can make fun of Vosh together. So um,
Absolutely, any day, any day. 100%.
um, so I guess like I don't know if you have anything else in closing before I hit you with one homework help question for me. If
Oh,
that's if I've earned it today.
no, that's that thing. I really appreciate the conversation. It's been really great.
Yeah, so this is completely off the wall from the subject. I don't know if you're familiar with like the Carnap and Quine dispute
Very well.
on
Analytic.
if we can even do metaphysics at all, right? And what that means to do
Yeah,
metaphysics.
what is it? Oh my God, what is it?
Just what's your opinion on it?
The
That's what I want to know.
Oh my God. Honestly, I don't think I could comment on Conop and Quine very well. I think like I'm so continental that like all of like if you had asked me a question about any continental thinker, I could probably answer it with some level of like oh like even if I'm not an expert, I would probably answer it. With analytic thinkers, my experience of Quine is essentially that from what I'm aware, he's more of like a phenomenalist, is he not?
Arthuria donated 7.
But I can't really answer it. I'm very sorry. I'm sorry. You're gonna have to do your homework. I'm really sorry.
So I think his thing is like he's saying metaphysics is more of like a real thing, and then and how we identify the items or what we're describing. So like any entity or object we describe is through descriptivism, right? So like I can describe this object empirically, and that's how I know it's there. Versus I think more of the Carnap side seems to be listen, I'm not saying that there's a description of this thing that is out there. When I say this exists, I'm saying it's useful to adopt a framework of this object of X, right? When I say that exists. So he's more like non-cognitivist with metaphysics.
Right. I think what I was going to say, one of them I think is a phenomenalist, and one of them's like a realist to some degree, but I don't know the ins and outs. I definitely need to research it because I should know it to talk analytics, but I'm just lazy in that respect. I'm being naughty, really.
Well, if I can get away with that on my education path, that's really all I need to know, because then I can just hightail it after this course is done and go away from analytic stuff, and that's good enough.
Well, I think analytic philosophy has its place. I think I'm very critical of it, like sometimes. But analytic philosophy, I was talking this with one of my professors, and he does both continental and analytic philosophy, and I was just like, I was saying to him, I was like, how? I'm like, how do you do it? Like, I just can't get away because at the time I was doing both an analytic and continental philosophy course. Like with my masters actually was part analytic as well as being continental. Like I was doing like Peter Geach and stuff like that. In like the philosophy of mind, and I was quite analytic based in terms of the philosophy of mind. But even then, I approached it from very continental, but in the way that the right and stuff like that, I was so used to it. I was like, I'm like, this is just such a different tradition. And he's like, it has its. He's like, it has its place. And I think that's probably the best way to look at it. Like, I think that sometimes analytic discussions really add clarity. Like, sometimes analytics can come into a discussion and then just say, like, what the fuck are you talking about, man? This is just poetry. Please stop. And then sometimes continentals come in and they look at the nuance and the like the human condition a little bit more. And I think that both of them have their place. I think. As harsh as on analytics as I can be. But yeah, well, good luck for your homework as well. I'm really sorry I can't help.
No worries. Just it's. I think you'll appreciate this. Like I think it's only 6 pages too, so it's not too bad. On semester day, so not too miserable. But
like, was that like 3,000? Was that like two and a half thousand words, 3,000 words?
Yeah, and I think it's a page maximum too. But I mean, granted, the page maximums I think are harder than minimums, right? Because you have to downsize to be more concise with the thoughts and everything, and you have to follow your best practices. But
you'll find that it's like the more the limit, the worse it gets. Like. There's actually a famous quote by a novelist. I can't remember who the novelist was. He says, "I would love to write short stories. I simply don't have the time."
I would have. If I had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. I think was that Lincoln, Churchill? It was somewhat important. I don't know.
Oh yeah, that was like I think that was an ex-president. I think that was an ex. But absolutely.
But yeah, thank you, man. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I feel like I got something out of this day, and I feel like I got to learn that side more, and that really helped me. So thank you so much, man.
Yeah, well,
Appreciate you, Lewis.
I really appreciate the conversation, and everyone in my chat, go and check out Walt's channel. Just go and say hello, show some love, from Perspective Philosophy, and obviously thank you to Arthuria again for hosting this. Really appreciate it, and check out the link to Arthuria if you want to see like discussions, debates, and so on like this. There's even moderators and stuff you can get. So yeah, check it out, man.